right, so we will be getting started now. Can everybody hear me? Is everybody able to hear me? You could just give me a thumbs up if you are able to hear me. That way we can get started. Thank you so much, guys. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be encouraging any and all questions that you have in the chat. Let's get started then. So once again, thank you so much for everybody and joining us in today's chat. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dr. Erica of Team IMG Helping Hands, and I am very excited to, just get started, go through our webinar today that is going to be covering the ERAS application, from ERAS application to match day. And we have a very important guest with us today. We have a very distinguished individual. We have Dr. Kaitlyn McSurdy. She is a cardiology fellow from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And I'm really excited to just talk with Dr. McSurdy on anything and everything related to ERAS application, maybe a couple little things in between. Dr. Kaitlyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Kaitlyn. So Dr. McSurdy, we're really eager to know, again, going from ERAS to match. Before touching up on the ERAS application and everything, I'm really interested to know about your journey, just, how you got to cardiology. Was cardiology a specialty that you were interested in while throughout medical school? Was it a newly, found interest? Just walk us through your past experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan honestly never really was cardiology, to be completely honest with you. So my interest in medicine actually started when I was pretty young, like elementary grade school young. My family is from a really rural area in Pennsylvania, and there's really not a lot of access to tertiary care. And so I myself actually did require, when I was first born, I had some lung issues. And so I had to be sent to a tertiary care facility, which required my parents to stay pretty far from home for a while. And then ultimately in high school, I ran track and field, and I developed asthma. I was pretty good at track and field, and I was hoping to get a scholarship. And as my asthma kind of flared up in the springtime, which is when track and field season tends to be kind of the highest volume, my asthma got a lot worse. My primary care doctor is actually the person who prescribed me an inhaled corticosteroid. And, from there, it was just insane how much I felt better. And I really wanted to have that same impact on people. Ultimately, I got to run track and field at a Division I school because of that. And so he made a huge impact on my life. I know he made a huge impact on my parents' lives as well. Because again, there's really not a ton of doctors where I grew up. There's some increase. It's increasing now. But when I was growing up, he was kind of the guy for the whole community and for the many miles far out. So, kind of from there, I went to undergrad. I majored in biology. And then I actually struggled a lot with balancing both my athletic requirements and also my academic requirements. And so, I had athletic advisors who were telling me, you should switch your major because this is keeping the team GPA down. I had academic advisors telling me you should quit track and field or you're never going to go to medical school. And so ultimately, I decided really not to listen to either of them. I knew I need to either work harder in some areas, find some mentors throughout who were going to help me get to where I needed to go. So I didn't really listen to them, which was both a good and a bad thing. I wouldn't be here if I did listen to them, but also simultaneously, I did horrific on the MCAT, which for those of you who aren't familiar is an exam that U.S. Undergraduate students take in order to get into medical school. And the U.S. medical school is very competitive. So I did really poorly. I took a year off. I studied and I took it again, and I still did just as bad the second time as I did the first time. And so I had multiple advisors telling me, don't go to medical school, don't go to medical school. You have to consider something else. And at that point, I started looking into foreign medical schools, which is, despite being from Pennsylvania, born and raised, that's what makes me an IMG. I did wind up going to St. George's in the Caribbean, and I have literally no regrets. I they give you the tools you need to do well on the exams that you need to do well on. A lot of finding the mentorship is kind of in your court. I was able to match at a university program for residency. I did much better on my USMLE exams than I did on either of the MCATs. But I had a lot of test anxiety, which I know is really common amongst IMGs. And I suffered a lot of that, especially within my first year of medical school. It was pretty debilitating. But onward and upward we went. I thought I wanted to do primary care because of the influence my primary care doctor had on, myself and my family growing up. And then ultimately I got into residency and I started rotating, and I really liked everything about medicine, and I still love primary care. But my specific interest with kind of my athletic background is on exercise, prevention, and nutrition. And within primary care, while those are all things that primary care doctors do a great job of, they do a great job of it, when they have the time, which is obviously a system flaw. And I think in primary care, you're the quarterback of so many things. I found myself, I was a quarterback of so many different medical comorbidities that, especially for the patients who really needed the time and the education on prevention, nutrition, and exercise counseling, those were also the same patients who had a lot of chronic comorbidities. And so it was really, really hard to actually be in clinic and dedicate a lot of time to kind of just the counseling aspect. And so I wanted to sort of take a path that would allow me to kind of be able to do that for a living. And, you could argue that can be done through endocrinology. They do a lot of, nutrition and metabolism. You can do it through GI. They do a lot of nutrition counseling. And then obviously cardiology is a big one as well. And so I think, my interest in residency between physiology and what I wanted in a clinical practice all really overlapped with cardiology. And so that's the route that I decided to take. And I think kind of beyond that, I've always been someone who has really wanted to make a big impact on a large scale, in addition to my patients' lives. And cardiovascular disease is the number one leading cause of mortality in the United States. So I thought there was plenty of room for improvement within the field. So that's sort of a long-winded way of how we got here.
Wow. No, and I think that's such an amazing journey. I just think it's so amazing. It almost feels like a movie, going through your athletic experience and merging it in with your academic one. And despite not following, other individuals' doubts, you still went through it. You still maintained, your vision of just a greater impact, and just really honed in on that when it came to both residency and fellowship. I mean, I think it's just so amazing. I love that. And I think it's such an inspiring journey, Dr. McSurdy. And specifically, a lot of not a lot, but, our current audience right now, we are IMGs. We are either IMG students, we are IMG graduates. And so, I might just emphasize on that particular area a little bit more, again, due to the nature of our audience. I just think it's amazing, again, just how you integrated everything together. But specifically in your experience going through Caribbean Medical School, again, I know there were some initial doubts by other individuals. You had an excellent time, again, navigating through a Caribbean Medical School, and again, just finding yourself, finding your desired specialty. How was navigating through, the Caribbean Medical School system like, as well as your extracurriculars, and just kind of bringing everything together in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why I do a lot of mentorship for IMG specifically. One, because I am technically an IMG myself. And two, while I technically am a US IMG and not a non-US IMG, which there are obviously slight nuances. One could argue that things are a little bit easier for US IMGs than they are non-US IMGs. I think that the struggles that we face often are very similar in terms of the bias that is against us. And so when I was in medical school, I think that the big hurdles were that, Caribbean medical students or Caribbean medical schools, my apologies, they accept a lot of students. So the class sizes are very, very large, and they often have multiple matriculation dates per year. So there's usually a summer class and a fall class, and now some places are even incorporating a spring class as well. So that's 3 classes of people for every one cycle of US medical student class. And so the class sizes opposed to US schools, which I think like a very large size class is about 300 students. My class had about 900 students in it. And again, that was just my fall class, not counting the other winter class that was ultimately also part of my year, which I think had about 500 students. So the class sizes are really large, which makes mentorship really, really challenging. And I also think that it makes advising really, really challenging. And so, I alluded to some of my struggles with advisors in the past and how I didn't really appreciate the advice they were giving me. And I think if there's one thing that I could impart on the audience is to make sure you recognize the difference between an advisor and a mentor. An advisor's job is strictly to advise you based on data, whether or not you should do something. They usually, more often than not, they have no background in what you are planning to set your mind to. So for example, neither of my advisors in undergrad were doctors. They weren't PAs. They weren't healthcare professionals at all. They were simply hired to look at the numbers every year of what percentage of people with what MCAT score and what grade get accepted into medical school and go on to residency. None of them had any idea of what it was actually like to go through that process. Versus a mentor. A mentor is someone who ideally is in a position in which you want to be in. So for example, when I was a resident, I had a female cardiology mentor who was from Venezuela. So she was also an IMG. So she was a female in the field I wanted to be in, who also had a similar educational background to me. So you want to find someone who has a similar experience in the past to you and also is where you want to go, because the job of a mentor is not just to advise you to or to not do something. They may give you the advice, your application isn't ready yet, don't do this yet, but their job is to help you get to where you want to go versus advisor who's just telling you do or do not do something. A mentor is going to tell you whether or not, how you can actually get there and whether or not the time is right yet. It doesn't mean that the answer is no or yes. You just need to kind of trust them and build whatever foundations they want you to build to get you to where you need to go. So just recognize that kind of upfront. There's a big difference between those two people. And then I think really the other challenge I faced as navigating the Caribbean, I am very extroverted. I really like traveling. I travel a lot on my own. And so I didn't really have trouble moving away from home, but a lot of people do kind of face that, cultural barrier, which a lot of you are IMGs. And so, when you first come to the US to do either your USCE or some type of clinical rotation or observership, or even if you come for the first time to do residency, you might face those cultural adjustments too. And like I said, I am pretty easy. I adapt to situations pretty easily. So it wasn't a huge struggle for me, but it doesn't mean it was easy. There was definitely a lot of cultural barriers that I had to get used to living in a different country that wasn't my own. So I think that the advising, which is really done on a general large scale rather than an interpersonal scale, were kind of the two biggest things. And again, that's why I have the platform that I do, because I was so frustrated that I was being given the same exact advice for people who failed USMLE step 1, and I did well above average on USMLE step 1. We were all getting the same advice because they were just taking average numbers and telling us this is the amount of programs you all need to apply to, which doesn't make any sense. So I try to give a little more personalized advice. I'll ask you guys a lot of questions to actually get to know your background. So again, when you're looking for a mentor, make sure you share a lot about your background. Don't be embarrassed if you have a quote unquote red flag. Your mentors need to know them and understand them and sort of realize what you've learned from them in order to help you get to where you need to go.
Got it. Wow. And I know you mentioned your mentor was a cardiologist from Venezuela. I'm really kind of curious to know how, you found her as a mentor and, just really kind of the impact that she had on you throughout the match process. Was she somebody you worked with at school? Was it somebody you reached out to? Nowadays, there's a lot of individuals out on the internet sharing their experiences as well. And, is she, how did you connect with her? And again, how was that impact throughout match?
Yeah, that's a great question. So also just to be very clear, the mentor that I had in residency was different than the mentor that I had as a medical student. So I actually, it might be helpful to start with what my first experience with mentors was like, because in undergrad to get myself into medical school and navigate through medical school, I had literally no one. I went to Caribbean Medical School before there was a lot of Caribbean Medical School influencers. There was no Instagram platform on, with all these people sharing their experiences. That wasn't a thing. I feel like I was sort of within like the kind of first group of people who started to do that. And so I literally only had people on Student Doctor Network telling me that I was not a real doctor because I was an IMG and that my patients were going to hate me. Like that's all I had. And so I was really struggling at one point during my third year of medical school to figure out if I wanted to pursue family medicine or internal medicine. And I didn't really fully understand kind of the scope of the differences. And so I actually reached out to this girl that I happened to be following on Instagram. Again, she was not an influencer. She was just like a regular person who was in residency in Philadelphia. And she happened to be in Philadelphia, which ideally is where she just happened to be there. And so I actually reached out to her because I saw that she was planning to do primary care, but she was an internal medicine resident. And I was so confused because I was like, family medicine means primary care. I don't understand. And she sort of explained to me the different pathways you can take within internal medicine, which we talk about at kind of a later time. But she was really the first person who taught me about it. And that's ultimately why I decided to do internal medicine. And again, she wasn't really someone I was ever really close with, but she was someone who I at least felt comfortable with kind of asking questions to, because again, I also didn't mention that I am the first person in my family to go into the healthcare field at all, let alone medicine. So I didn't even have any like family friends or anything who'd been through this process to ask. So she was very nice. Again, this was like before people had like thousands of followers, but she like had just a couple followers who were probably her friends. And I was just reaching out to her on a regular basis, just kind of asking her for her thoughts and advice. And then I had connected with some alumni from my school once I learned about that, who also wound up doing primary care through internal medicine. And, none of those people at this point I have maintained a longitudinal relationship with. Again, I feel like once I decided I was going to go into cardiology, not that their mentorship by any means becomes not helpful. They're still great colleagues to remain connected with for when I have a question about my patients and I need an answer from a primary care doctor. They're still so helpful, like in terms of that. But in terms of getting me to my next steps, it's kind of, they help me get to where I need to go. And then I needed new mentors to kind of surface me to the next level of where I wanted to go from there. And that is when I was a second year resident, I had met with one of the cardiologists that I happened to work on service with when I was on the cardiology service as an intern, just to sort of let them know, hey, I'm interested in cardiology. What kind of advice do you have? Should I start research? Like, what do I need to do? And it's not really someone who I intended to have as a mentor. I was just like, I need help. Can you help me find someone who can like be a good fit for myself as a mentor? And, given my background, I mentioned to them, they were like, what are you looking for in a mentor? And I was like, well, I need someone who's going to help me with research. And I had zero research background as a resident. So I was like, I need someone who is not like a top-notch researcher and expects me to know how to like do statistics and is like, here's this project, but like do it all on your own. I'm like, I need someone who will kind of hold my hand through the process. Like, I know I need to do research, but I also need to like learn how to do research because I don't know how. And I was like, I obviously don't care if it's a male or female, but it might be nice to have someone who's a female so you can kind of talk about life stuff also. And I, also am not objected to working with someone who doesn't have a similar training background to me. But again, it's helpful to have someone who you can connect with that over, and also maybe freak out about how, your colleagues are like getting more interviews than you, because that's just how things go. And they can just kind of, talk you down and remind you that they're in the same position and that you can be in the same position that they are, regardless of what this, kind of follow you.
I love that. And so I really love the way just everybody has been so accessible. That's ultimately what it's all about, right? Just being accessible to others, lending a helping hand, being, available to either being of help or being helped, knowing, your strengths and shortcomings. I think that's just so amazing. And I'm so happy that you got to connect with them through social media. I feel like that's kind of been more of a newer way to connect with individuals now. You can just kind of find their profiles on either LinkedIn or on Instagram. You could just chat them up. You don't have to wait 3 to 5 business days sometimes, and they'll be available to help you. I think that's just such a neat way, or just such a neat concept in the way, mentorship has kind of been transcending over in now these generations and future ones, and so when it came to the ERAS application and the match process, then, again, speaking of strengths and weaknesses, how was that experience like for you, Dr. McSurdy? Were there any shortcomings that you had to kind of, mention aside from being an IMG? I know there might have been a stigma, how did you navigate, those potential red flags, so to say, in your application, if you had any, and vice versa with the strengths?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually think that I feel fortunate to have had most of my, I guess, red flags or shortcomings as an undergrad. Like, my big struggle was getting into medical school somewhere because my GPA was not very good. My MCATs were both really bad, not even kind of bad. They were very bad. And I really didn't have a ton of clinical experience either. So I was just a general weak applicant from the beginning, and I really didn't know what to do about it. Again, I had no one to mentor me, so I didn't really know what to do. Versus when I was applying for residency, I did take a lot of time. I took to focus on my study habits when I was in Caribbean medical school. And I think that's what really helped me optimize my application for residency. I did very well on both step 1 and step 2. I'm old, so I had a grade on step 1, not just pass fail. And so I think both of those things automatically helped put me in a good position, because I knew early on that is the number one thing I was going to have to figure out. Because if you can prove that on a standardized exam, your knowledge is exactly the same as a US medical student, they have no reason to question what you do or do not know. A lot of programs, are hesitant with IMG, one, because sometimes they require visas. That's sometimes the excuse that they'll use. And then sometimes the other excuse that they'll use is, well, we're not really familiar with what their educational background was. Like, we don't know what they learned in medical school. But if you get the same score on a USMLE exam as a US student, then clearly you learned the same things and or more. So I knew that is one way that I could just even the playing field. So I focused so much on my study habits. When I got to residency interviews, I think there was a lot of confusion about why I was in Caribbean medical school, because I had done so well academically. So again, I had to then explain my red flags from the past. But I feel like I didn't have that many red flags as a residency applicant, thank God. The other thing I will say, though, is I didn't have a ton of research. I know nowadays research is a little bit more required, which I won't rant on now, but I think is ridiculous. But it is seen more favorably if you do have some research. I had like one case report, and I had started a small QI project, but otherwise I had literally no research. Like I said, when I got to residency, I needed a mentor who was going to hold my hand. I didn't even know the difference between an abstract and a manuscript. They're very different. Like, an abstract for presenting a poster at a conference and a manuscript, I thought they were packaged as one. If you presented at a conference, you got a manuscript, and that is very much not true. But that just goes to show how much research experience I did not have when I came into residency. So again, I think if I had a red flag, that was probably the one. Though I will say, when I applied, I don't think people were quite as honed in and focused on research as they are now. Even now, they're focused on a well-rounded application. I just think it is becoming so much more competitive that well-rounded, all of the sections kind of weigh a lot more and look a lot plumper. But again, I had some research experience. That's the important thing. You should have something. It doesn't have to be big, but you should have something to fill that section. So I think that's sort of how I navigated my red flags. But most of them just came from Like, why are you here? I'm confused. But then, you're still attached to that IMG label. Like, yes, it feels good to hear that from programs, but at the end of the day, in their eyes, like, I am still an IMG, which I am proud of, but it does make things more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Wow. And, I think it's really interesting that you really pointed out, just the way you kind of, like you said, evened out the playing field with your STEP exam, because, I have here a question from the chat, actually. Individuals who might not have the most optimal transcript, so to say, do you think maybe the USMLE can kind of remedy that or compensate for that? And it kind of seems to be the case, because, the way you explained it, if somebody, regardless of their transcript, ends up performing optimally or even above average, then that essentially kind of will speak to themselves and should continue pursuing, the STEP and just the overall match process then, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like I said, I think it's the easiest way as an IMG to even the playing field. Now, granted, I say that with like a grain of salt. The playing field will never be completely even, which again is ridiculous. I have a lot of rants about the way the system is set up. But the best thing that you can do yourself to put you in the most optimal position is do well on your exams, by and large.
Got it. And then again, as I was reading this question, more questions started popping up. And again, I know you mentioned your experience with research, and I have been noticing that as well. Just really that importance, in research, and just I did initially have that doubt as well, whether an abstract and a manuscript were the same thing, or if you presenting at a conference was the same thing as, one thing or another. And so, I think maybe looking at it from the perspective of nowadays, would you say, I have another question here, would you say that, conference presentations do you think they could definitely be a benefit to your application? Would it be necessary to have conference presentations, research, manuscripts? Again, whether it would be to remedy certain shortcomings, or, even out of pure interest?
Absolutely. I think that presenting an abstract at a conference comes with two huge benefits. Number one, like I said, you don't have to have 10 manuscripts. Yes, manuscripts are weighted probably the most heavily in terms of if you have research on your application and you have 1 or 2 manuscripts versus 5 or 6 poster presentations at a conference. Those 1 or 2 manuscripts probably do carry a little bit more weight than the 4 or 5 conference presentations that you have. That being said, presenting at a conference is more than enough for a residency application. No one is expecting you to be a world-class researcher applying for residency. They know you want to be a clinician. The goal is just for you to have some experience in hypothesis creation, and even like if you're doing a case report, just digging into a specific topic, like all of that shows interest in advancing the field. It shows your commitment to the field and to advance it. And so again, I also want to be very clear. The reason I do a lot of mentorship that's one-on-one is because this is very different for internal medicine than it is for surgery. You need to have 15 research experiences for surgery residency application. For internal medicine, it's more about the actual experience. For surgical subspecialties, again, they're a whole kind of different ball game. But the other benefit that really comes from presenting an abstract at a conference is not only that you get to put it on your application under the research, but you get to go to the conference and network with people, which is by far, like STEP scores and research and community outreach, all of this aside, hobbies aside, whatever else is on ERAS aside, finding yourself a mentor and making connections at a conference, by and large, the best way to get your foot in the door. You will meet so many people, and I think poster sessions, again, kind of out of the scope of this, but I talk about a lot on my page. Poster sessions are actually a really non-intimidating, low-key way to network. People are always like, I'm really nervous to go up to this world-class speaker who's giving a talk on, I don't know, some kind of rheumatologic disorder. And like, yeah, that is definitely intimidating. And you can do that and it can be helpful. But a nice, easier way is to just kind of network with people in the poster hall over, your interesting case. You can meet a lot of residents and fellows from other programs in the poster hall too, which, again, may not be the people who you're trying to connect with in terms of, you want to try and connect with attendings or program directors, but still connecting with other residents can be really helpful. You can learn a lot about programs that way, which gives you insight into, where you might want to apply, what their experience is like. You might connect with other IMGs and you can ask them about their experience. Poster halls are a really great way that are really low key that you can actually connect with other people.
And that seems to be a really nice kind of hack, like you mentioned it. Again, in addition to exploring what is being offered on the internet, you kind of had the added step of having these people in person with you. So at the end of the day, there is definitely that added benefit in research, like you said, where if you do research, it contributes to communicating your overall interest in the field, but likewise going to the conference just really both enhances that and adds the networking aspect. I think that's a really great thing to consider, again, for anybody going through, the application cycles, how to navigate them, how to maybe get a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily say of an advantage, but just kind of, leveraging yourself and so forth. And I think those are really neat things to consider. And, there's a pretty good question here that, is also here in the chat. They are related to personal statements, since you mentioned extracurriculars with regards to, your clinical experience, being involved in research. There are some individuals who are inquiring about your personal statement. And to be honest with you, I'm a little curious myself as well, being how you were a former, not former, but, being that you were an athlete, a student athlete, to now being, pursuing internal medicine, going into cardiology, and then the added aspect as well, because I know you've been mentioning it, throughout the conversation, also being, an internet mentor and influencer. I did also go through your page and I really like the way you integrated, fashion with, the application application cycles and everything and lifestyles. How did you put all of these together into your personal statement, or how did you communicate them in your application? I just think that's something really neat.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And so I do see a lot of people in chat asking about personal statements, and they are easy to give advice on. They are hard to write. And so I do personal statement revisions if anyone is interested or stressed out about it. I'm happy to help you with your personal statement. Just message me on my page, or send me an email at the link that's in my page. But my personal statement for residency, I felt like my residency one was a little bit better than fellowship. Fellowship was a little busy. The time I was writing my personal statement was a little bit busier. So I feel like I was not as thoughtful or reflective as I wanted to be, but my residency one was very centered around athletics. Again, I sold myself as wanting to do primary care. So I did talk a lot about my experience in athletics and nutrition. And if there's one piece of advice I can give to you for the interview process that I really didn't learn until I was applying for fellowship, is try to figure out how you want to sell yourself on the interview trail. I think a lot of people are intimidated by interviews and they assume it's going to be like a program director or a faculty member asking them a lot of questions, which it is. You are going to get asked a lot of questions, but think about what you want to communicate to them and what you want them to take away from all of your answers. So in my personal statement, again, it was centered around track and field. I talked a lot about my experience with my family being from a community that's like not really well serviced by medicine or healthcare systems. And so I also framed that, I kind of integrated that with my experience growing up, and also I was looking for a program that was more kind of community service driven, and served an underserved patient population. I wasn't really interested in going somewhere like, I don't know, Yale or something like that, where they serve like a little bit more of a well-off patient population, even though they're like Ivy League and people would be like, I'm dreaming of being there. It's just not what I personally wanted my training to be. And so that's sort of how I tied my personal statement together. And that's how I sold myself on the interview trail. And when you think about how you want to sell yourself, you really want to take a look at your application and see what your application speaks also. When you or have a mentor look through your application and think about what characteristics your application is speaking. So most of my community outreach experiences were like volunteering at road races or marathons, or they were global health related. And most of my global health rotations were done. I did a global health rotation in Ghana, and then I obviously did medical school in Grenada, and then I did a rotation in Kenya as well. And so these are all countries that don't have great access to medical care. And so again, most of my experiences were kind of primary care focused, and I tied them together with my interest in prevention and community outreach, and all of that, I think, between my application and my personal statement and my story kind of came as a package. If you don't have, if your experiences, sometimes your experiences are kind of all over the place, which I see with fellowship applications a lot, because you have a very short time to do a lot of research for fellowship, especially for something competitive like cardiology. And so people are really just doing projects that they can get their hands on at their institution. Whatever their institution does a lot of research in is what most residents wind up doing, because A, they have access to it, and B, the institution wants people pushing out research too. So they need the extra hands. And so it's a little bit harder to package yourself nicely when things are kind of all over the place. But just find something that you are passionate about, some experiences that support that. If you're still working on strengthening your application and you're not applying this cycle, I would try to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about the experiences that you're trying to get, so that they do sort of fit your goal, your personality, what you want your application to say, so that when the time comes and you are interviewing, your story kind of flows really nicely. And again, it's okay to have, it's good to have, experiences that are in areas that aren't within that little box, because it shows, that you're interested in a lot of other things and that you're exploring, like all of that is good. But when you're actually selling yourself, you should have some kind of story. And that's something I wish I knew for residency, that I didn't. I think I did it unintentionally, but I was much more aware of it and actively tried to focus on that for fellowship applications.
Wow. So just essentially being like a really good storyteller, essentially, as you mentioned, and selling yourself, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
And with lies, but I feel like sometimes fabrication makes good stories. It's okay to fabricate a little bit if you have to, but lying, they will, as someone who has been on the side of reviewing applications at this point, I did a year as a chief resident. So I actually got to see what it looks like to go through thousands of applications and build a rank list and go through interview season. I will tell you that it is easy to tell when people are lying and when people are using AI to generate their personal statements.
Especially the AI. Oh my goodness. No, I appreciate that you let us know of that, because sometimes people think they can get away with it. Let me at least do this little paragraph, or let me get this little help here from AI. But it's easy to see. And so I think it's really neat that you got to be on both sides as an applicant and as a reviewer. What are some ways that some students stood out to you then, whether it be through experience or their personal statement, or, what were some of the more remarkable student profiles like to you, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. I think that this is why I'm happy that I had the year, because I feel like it's not everyone has the experience of being on both sides. But I think the thing that I learned from being on the other side is the importance of the storytelling. And I say that because a lot of programs, especially community-oriented ones, are looking for, when they're building their rank list, which means they're also looking at it when they're selecting applicants, is something called a mission fit. And so basically a mission fit is whatever that, if you can go on either the program's site, sometimes the program will have a separate one and the hospital will have a separate one, but more often than not, the hospital at least will have a, what is it called? Like a mission statement.
Like a mission statement, yeah.
They'll have like a mission statement. And so you want to have an idea of what they're focused on as an institution. And if the program has one, obviously you want to look at what the program's mission statement is. But I feel like most hospitals will have their mission statement listed online, and you should take a look at that and see how your application fits into that. Because for my residency program that I had helped review applications for, the ones that stood out the most were the ones that we were a very community service hospital, despite being a university program. And it was anyone who was focused on serving the community and community outreach and community engagement and kind of developing things in those areas were definitely the people who stood out more than the people who had 50 research projects. So that's a perfect example of, university programs are usually looking for research, but you have to know what their mission is, because yes, you can have 50 research projects, but if there are 50 research projects related to like interleukin 6, blah, 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 and it is a community program, and if you have 50 research projects that are on like, how we improve disparities in GI clinic for, I don't know, colon cancer screening, for example, like, yes, then okay, 50 research projects are probably looked favorably upon. But if it's 50 research projects that are on like, microRNAs and stuff, like, yes, that's amazing for a specific subset of programs. But for those that don't have that within their mission statement and they're really focused on the community, then it's a nice additive factor, but you still don't really fit what they're looking for. And so be mindful of what the programs are looking for and what the kind of hospital's mission statements are. I think that is what I found that stood out the most, because especially after serving as a resident at my program, I can't imagine being someone who hated community outreach, because a lot of work felt like community outreach as a resident. So I can't imagine not having that as an interest and having to work where I did residency.
Oh, definitely. Wow. And, I like really just how you communicated everything, and how being a good storyteller will convey your experiences very well. But then at the same time, the experiences in your CV kind of, connect with the school's mission statement with respect to relevance and so forth. It's just all an integration of everything all together. And I think it's just something very, very good to keep in mind, again, when creating your application, when selecting your programs and so forth. And this could definitely be something that, one can consider, because I believe now there's a limited amount, or, with the 10 experiences that you have to include, you can kind of base yourself now off those mission statements, so to say, or off just, the general hospital profile, and kind of tailor your application and your respective experiences to that then, correct?
Yes, exactly. And I, when a couple of years ago, this honestly, every single year that passes, I realize that I am getting older, because we had unlimited experiences when I applied. So we could list as many as we want. But when I applied for fellowship, it was down to 10. But I remember everyone freaking out when they switched from unlimited experiences to 10 experiences. And it's really, as someone who's now done both, it is not a big deal. You can package a lot of what you've done into, you'll be surprised when you're filling out the application as to how much you can actually package into one experience. So like, for example, if you have done like 6 research projects at a specific, institution, for example, and if you have them published, you obviously put them in publications. But if you haven't published anything, then you put them as an experience. And so, traditionally, when I applied to residency, they would be listed separately because we have limited experiences. But now, if you're doing research at Johns Hopkins and you researched something in GI, something in oncology, and something in rheumatology, you can still list all 3 of them. You research at Johns Hopkins and you describe the 3 projects that you did in one experience. So you still get 3 experiences in one box.
Oh, God. Yes.
So you can definitely, like when I applied for fellowship, I wish I had unlimited experiences, because as chief resident, I wore about 60 hats. But instead of listing 60 things, I just listed chief resident as one thing. And I explained like maybe 50 of the 60 things that I had to do as a chief resident. So again, you'll be surprised when you actually start to put these things together. Again, if you need any help, I also review CVs, so please reach out and we can maximize what you've done in a way that's not messy. Because sometimes I see applicants try and just fit as much as they can in, and then it doesn't really make any sense and it gets a little jumbled and looks disorganized. So we don't want that either. But I feel like most things on your application, you will be able to fit into the 10 experiences.
Got it. Okay, yeah, that was kind of a question that I had myself as well. If the reduction was really going to be, something major to consider and so forth. But the way you explain it doesn't really seem like it's much of a change overall. Then it's more of a layout type of situation, which is still pretty good. And there's another pretty good question here by Sakar, and I know you did mention the difference between the unlimited versus the 10 ERAS experiences going from residency and fellowship. Was going into cardiology, a topic that you mentioned when you were going into residency? Was that something that might have influenced either, in your personal statement or their choice? He does mention here, did you say that you wanted to be a hospitalist? Again, just really, how did you convey that overall, if you don't mind us asking?
No, that's a great question. I did not mention a lick of anything about cardiology in my residency personal statement. And my advice to you, and again, I see this year after year when I'm reviewing personal statements, people who know, I feel like oncology tends to be, I know it's very specific, but people who want to do oncology, I feel like often know going into residency. For some reason, it just happens that way. And they will try to structure their personal statement talking about why they want to be an oncologist. Well, if I'm an internal medicine program director, I am not going to want you in my program because I need someone who is interested in GI. I need someone who's interested in rheumatology, because 3 years is a long time and you're going to have to rotate through all of those things. And if all you're talking to me about in your personal statement is oncology and what makes you a good oncologist, I am going to be a lot less interested. You will have the opportunity to write a personal statement for oncology in the future, but you should be focusing on all of the things that you love about internal medicine or surgery, regardless of what you want to subspecialize in. It's okay, in your conclusion paragraph, if you want to mention, I'm interested in potentially GI or potentially hospital medicine. Programs don't care that you change your mind. They don't. I think fellowship programs are a little bit pickier on having, diverse classes in terms of interest. Like in cardiology, they want some people who want to go into heart failure, some people who want to go into interventional, et cetera. Internal medicine, I don't think they care because the class sizes are usually so much larger. And by default, people will because there are more people, they will wind up doing more different things. And so they are not nearly as picky. And so programs for internal medicine are also okay with you saying, I'm not sure I want to explore. That's a totally acceptable answer too. But what I will say is if you are someone who has an early interest in something like oncology, I keep using this as an example, so we'll just keep up with that. But if you want to do oncology and you find a community program, which by the way, I think community programs are fantastic for the people they are a good fit for. But if you want to do groundbreaking research in oncology and be this high level oncologist, maybe a community program isn't the place for you. And talking about that is only going to also scare them off. So it's not a good way to get an interview somewhere that doesn't offer those things. So just be mindful when you are creating your personal statements. You do actually want it to be personal and specific to you, but you also want it to be a little bit vague, right? Because you're not going to write, if you apply to 150 programs, you're not going to apply to 150, or you're not going to create 150 different personal statements, right? Some people will change the line so that it says the program's name, but you're not going to literally write a different personal statement for every single program. So you want it to be a little bit generalized in the sense where if you're going into family medicine, I really love the diversity of cases you get to see. I love that you get to rotate through all of the specialties. I love that you are kind of the quarterback. I love that you're kind of the, that you get to do both surgery and medicine, that you get to take care of a spectrum of patients from, newborns all the way through the elderly. Those things are important to mention. Internal medicine, the common things that are most people write are things like, I love taking care of adults. I love the complexity of the cases, the long patient list, patient problem lists, the discharge planning and making sure patients can have what they need when they go back out into the community. All of those things are specific to internal medicine. They want to know that you like those things because that is going to be most of your job for 3 years or forever if you decide to do hospital medicine or primary care. And again, it's okay to be specific with what you want if but don't be so specific that it's going to shy some programs away, or you should just not apply to those programs if you know that they're not going to get you where you need to go, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. And I feel like that answers, these questions pretty well, because yeah, it's definitely something good to consider. Again, going into the application process, it definitely ties into the whole mission statement, topic that we were talking about earlier, where you want to really tie your application in with both the hospital and the program's mission statement, but at the same, keep a little bit of yourself, maintain some of that authenticity, but again, without really isolating yourself too much. So, I guess just kind of finding that middle ground, but at the same time, just waiting it out and really talking about, again, oncology once you start your fellowship application and so forth, maybe touch up on it for residency, but really get into it for the future ones. And I think that's a really, excellent strategy to go about that as well. And I do believe, I'm not sure if the question was removed, but I know somebody had also mentioned regarding, certain years of graduation. Do you think that is something that might impact an individual's application, something that gets addressed in interviews as well?
Yeah, I will say 5 years will raise I hate calling them red flags, because I don't think any of these things are bad as long as you're learning from them. But for lack of better terms, 5 years out of graduation will definitely be a red flag. In terms of combating them, obviously you can't go back and change time and apply sooner, right? So it is one of the harder red flags to address. But I also think that it really depends on what those 5 years have looked like. If those 5 years have looked like you practicing in your home country as a hospitalist or a cardiologist or whatever you're practicing, and you're like doing some research here and there, and you've been like studying for board exams and trying to get some USE or USCE to improve your application for when you do apply, that's very different than 5 years where you just haven't really been in touch with medicine. Those are two very different 5 years, and some people do take time off to care for family and things like that. And then again, regardless of what the reason is, it's unfortunately still seen as a red flag. But what programs care more about, the programs who will still interview applicants with a long period out of medical school, then they will be more interested in what you've been doing in that time than how much time had actually passed, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. No, and again, definitely that can also be a good talking point when it comes to either communicating it in your personal statement, communicating it in your interviews and so forth, and just that overall storytelling process that you mentioned, and I did just want to, take a moment to mention here that I did provide a comment here in the chat, and I will share it once again, because I just feel there's been so much invaluable information that's being shared. And just with everything that you're mentioning to us, Dr. McSurdy, again, I really do want to appreciate your time in, just sharing all of your experiences with us, sharing all of these great tips for navigating the application process and how to just present yourself in the best way possible. I did just want to remind everybody too that, we do have our research community, so you could join our WhatsApp research community, as you mentioned, staying involved in research. That way you can, if you are going through those gap years, how to stay involved, we can definitely touch up on that. If you are interested in U.S. clinical experiences, we can definitely assist you in finding you the right opportunity by scheduling a consultation, additional services regarding outside of research, regarding, again, CV, interview prep, and so forth. I did just want to kind of touch up on that, because these are just excellent points that we mentioned throughout the conversation. And I cannot appreciate this enough, Dr. McSurdy. And I did also share, if you don't mind, I did also include your Instagram as well, because again, I think it's just something really neat, to follow and go through, whether the person is pursuing cardiology or not, because I just, in that essence of storytelling, you you do such an excellent job of showing that balance between, being a fellow, but also, as we mentioned, remaining and staying true to your authentic self. And, something that I was kind of curious to know as well is, is it difficult to manage being an influencer, in being, a fellow nowadays? I know, again, with stigmas and everything, sometimes people might say careful with what you post, but how is that part of your life impacted your clinical life and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that it is sometimes hard to balance, especially right now. I'm trying to train for a marathon also. So unfortunately, there's only 24 hours in a day. I feel like if there were 28, this would be a little bit of a different story. I think I just need like maybe 3 or 4 more extra hours. But first year, the hours are really, really long. So I was not as on top of, I try to create my content so that it kind of aligns with the application cycle. So right now I'm doing a lot of posting for fellowship interviews and kind of how to navigate those. Whereas, in the next month or so, I'll transition to like personal statement, ERAS advice, and then interview for residency preparation. And then, kind of so on and so forth as the cycle goes. But I was not really able to stay on that as much this year because the hours of a first year fellow are so long and chaotic, which is the same issue that I found when I was an intern. My hours as of this past week are a lot better. And so I already have a bunch of posts already planned. And I thought of 2 other ideas while we were sitting here that I should post about. So I think that being an influencer, quote unquote, whatever we want to call it, is really rewarding. I think I have gotten to make so many connections. I have met mentors of my own on this platform. I have met so many mentees, and I love going to conferences where people are like, hey, I know you from Instagram. And then we just have a great conversation about like life in medicine. It's really rewarding to get to kind of, extend myself and meet people from so many different backgrounds who've had so many different stories. And it really helps, like, you guys help me build my network to help other people move forward too, right? Like, I've never had to apply for a J1 visa or an H1B visa. And so when I have people who have those questions or want to know what it feels like or what that process feels like, I look to you guys to actually be the ones to give that advice. I'll be like, this is a mentee that I have who successfully did it. I actually want you to talk to this person, and it just helps grow the community a lot. And I think that's really, really special. And then on top of that, I think that especially in the United States, obviously I'm biased because I live here, but particularly here, there is a lot of medical misinformation. And so even if physicians don't want to be in the mentorship space, it's really a good place to be in the education space as well, because for some reason, a lot of people are turning to social media instead of their doctors for medical advice. And the more physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses or whatever that we have on social media, I really think that that is beneficial for patients and for society as a whole. So I think that my social media page is a really special place. And I love that you guys are a part of my community.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. And again, thank you so much for including us into your space as an influencer. I think it's amazing that we get to connect in that regard, as you said. And, it's also something fun to do after clinic hours. Do something fun, share a little bit of fun content, but that is still at the end of the day meaningful, because it at the end of the day fulfills the goal of informing, or maybe just kind of, taking a little breather. But again, I just think that's so amazing, Dr. McSurdy. And, before we do finalize this webinar, I was curious to know if you had some lasting words, any last advice you would like to impart to our audience today.
Let's see. I think if I could recap, my biggest pieces of advice would be, don't let someone tell you no. Just find someone who will help you get to where you need to go, regardless of what your red flags are. If there's a will, there's a way. Sometimes the way requires a lot of work. Sometimes the way requires a lot of money, but there's usually a way. And so don't let people tell you no, unless they've actually been in a similar situation to you, because there will always be someone out there who's willing to try and help you get to where you want to go. And then sort of the other thing is, try not to be so focused on what other people are doing. Everyone's journey is so unique, which again is why I post a lot of generalized advice for people to take with what they will, but my mentoring is very one-on-one. If you're reaching out to someone on social media, it is a great way to connect with a mentor, but also remember that it is still kind of a professional space. So if you're reaching out to someone, still address them by their name, still let them know who you are about yourself, just as if you were sending an email, because, you know, knowing a little bit about your background ultimately helps us understand you more and help you better as to getting you where you want to go. And then last but not least, these mentorship packages people are selling on social media are a scam. Don't buy them. There are plenty of us who are willing to help you for free. It's all the same information, and most people are just selling you their opinions. So if you have questions, reach out to people who are going to answer them for free, because there are a lot of us. Do not spend $5,000 on someone's residency prep course who's just going to tell you the information that they use to get where they were, because it's not necessarily specific to you. You want someone who's going to give you specific advice to your own background and your own goals. And a lot of those kind of courses that are being created nowadays are just not, they're just meant for general advice, just like I was receiving from my Caribbean medical school. So they're really no different. They're the same people who face the same issues, who are unfortunately propagating the same thing forward. So find a mentor that is going to help you with your background get to where you want to go.
Got it. Perfect. No, well, thank you so much once again, Dr. McSurdy. And again, I am sharing all our information once again. I think this was a very helpful and insightful conversation, because we really got to touch up on everything, you know, everything from ERAS. We got to know a lot about you, both as a physician and outside of a physician, outside being a physician. By the way, I'm also training for a race as well. I do enjoy running long distance, so I totally understand where you're coming from in that perspective as well. And so, you know, we got to learn about you. You shared a lot of your excellent experiences, both as a resident and somebody who was a reviewer as well. You know, definitely anybody who wasn't here, I would probably say might have missed out. And so I really do encourage everybody to continue staying connected. Again, the resources with opportunities that both we offer and Dr. McSurdy offers are listed in the chat. I do highly encourage you guys to take advantage, really, really take advantage. You know, that way you can get the most out of enhancing your applications, the connections, the networks, and just really expanding your network, as you mentioned, Dr. McSurdy, because at the end of the day, it's about, you know, if you need help, you lend a hand, you know, and you remain connected in that regard. I think that was a very good, just overall theme that I saw in today's conversation, just really staying connected with individuals, really maintaining that network, really connecting and maintaining that camaraderie. So thank you so much once again, Dr. McSurdy.
Of course, thank you so much again for having me, and thanks again for being part of my community. Good luck, guys.
Of course. Thank you so much.